We're in the midst of this narrative about Imperial China, in particular the Ming period. And the height of it, of course, was the 16th century, when whether it wanted to or not, there was this huge, it was a global market. And so foreigners came to China to trade. And at the same time, I explained that, in fact, the power structure of Ming China, based on the emperor and the mandarins and the rule of the landlords, was quite conservative. And so, despite the very impressive commercial and even manufacturing development in China, a kind of proto-capitalism, this ruling apparatus, was resistant. And ideologically, this expressed itself in this Neo-Confucian conservatism, which I explained. Now, as to the actual foreign policy of China, I think the great symbol of this this reticence towards particularly foreign influences, commercial influences, is symbolized by the Great Wall of China, north of Beijing, which was above all designed to keep out the Mongol invaders. But it also sort of suggests sort of guarding the frontiers. That was the basic objective of Chinese foreign policy. And I've explained there's the tribute system, and any state that wanted relations with China had to kowtow, had to accept Chinese superiority, the superiority of the emperor. In terms of what the Chinese state did in the 16th century, well, I explained that they, at various points, they sent military forces into Mongolia in terms of sort of preventive attacks to break up what they thought was the possibility that the Mongolians would mass for another invasion. In Vietnam, they restored a dynasty which they favored, and a rival dynasty had challenged their friends in Vietnam, so the Chinese intervened. And in particular, they intervened in Korea when the Japanese, who were increasingly consolidating a strong state based on a very strong military. The military tradition in China, in Japan, is ferocious. There was this violent war in the 1590s between Japan and China, and the Japanese were driven out. And indeed, the one state that really didn't have this by the mid-16th century, the one Asian state that did not have tributary relations with China, was Japan. Japan was increasingly independent. Now, in terms of the Chinese state, probably the biggest threat from their point of view were the foreign merchants who flocked to China. And by foreign merchants, of course, I mean merchants from all over Asia, but also increasingly Europeans, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and eventually, toward the end of the 16th century, the English and the French put in merchants, arrived on the shores of China. We saw that in the 15th century, prior to this, there had been the great voyages, these political voyages, to try and organize the relations between China and foreign powers. This went nowhere. And in the 16th century, there was a huge influx of these foreign merchants trying to do business with China, trying to buy silk, to buy porcelain, to bring their products to trade. And the people, the Chinese people who lived along the coast were attracted to this trade. They also, you know how many merchants there were in China and so on. They wanted to do business as well. And this, of course, goes back to already the Middle Ages. From the 12th, 13th century, Chinese were doing business, Chinese merchants were doing business with foreigners. And in fact, as I explained, already during the Middle Ages, colonies of Chinese merchants moved to the Philippines, moved to Vietnam, moved to various places in Asia, and these are known as the Chinese diaspora. The Chinese diaspora, like you have the Jewish diaspora, you have the Armenian diaspora. Well, you have it's very important Chinese diaspora, which still exists and is still very important. And diasporas, in terms of commerce, world commerce, play a very important role. Now, the Chinese state tried to police this, to regulate this whole thing. They were worried, given the nature of the Chinese state, as I've explained, that they would bring in, these foreigners would bring in all kinds of foreign influences. They would corrupt Chinese society. This was not entirely irrational, but that they would undermine, especially from their point of view, the Confucian order. The Confucian order would be threatened. And in response, the local populations, the Chinese populations along the coast, of course, they were part of China and they thought of themselves as Chinese. They thought of themselves as loyal to the emperor, the Ming emperor, the Han emperor, and so on. But at the same time, they wanted to do business. And so conflicts developed. Indeed, there was growing violence and piracy on the part of both the foreigners who were trying to do business, but also local Chinese who were defying the police of the Ming state. And this kind of conflict continued until the middle of the 16th century, when the Ming bureaucracy decided, well, maybe we should allow a certain amount of this trade to continue. They sort of adjusted themselves. They allowed the foreigners to come to certain ports, and in particular, they set up the port of Macau. The port of Macau, which is along the coast in central China, and permitted the Portuguese to establish a trading post, or what they called a factory. Now, this Portuguese outpost has a long history. From this point until, I guess it was the mid-1970s, the Portuguese had, just as they had Goa in India, they had Macau until the mid-1970s, when under pressure, and also the Portuguese were having their own revolution. A revolution was going on in Portugal. And so the Portuguese handed Macau over to the Chinese, and Macau today is a big gambling center. You probably know that a lot of Chinese are attracted to gambling, they like gambling, and Macau is the center of the gambling industry in China, and a lot of foreign tourists who are similarly inclined, they visit Macau because that's where it's the sort of Las Vegas of China. And of course, that gives you an insight into the way, after all, we're dealing with a communist regime. They've accommodated. This is called socialism with Chinese characteristics. So you have that reality. Now, we should say maybe a little bit more about this in the sense that the importance of these sort of special enclaves for foreigners in the 19th century, this became really important as Western imperialism obtruded, pushed into China. The Chinese state was forced to open up along the coast a whole series of ports where foreigners could do business. And of course, the most important was Hong Kong. And it remained an outpost until only lately it became Chinese, I think at the end of the 1990s, but the population there, they had become so British, and the British had so much influence, the British and the Americans, that the population really were not integrated into China. And so you see that there was this struggle lately, and basically the Chinese state cracked down, and now Hong Kong is firmly under the control of the central government, although from what I've learned, and these are recent, this is recent research, the level of Western activity in Hong Kong has continued. That is to say, Western investment continues, despite the political crackdown. And the regime itself has used, the communist regime has used this system of special enclaves, factory zones, where Westerners, since the disappearance of Mao Zedong in the 1970s, China set up these foreign enclaves, and it helped China to accelerate its economic development. Now, as a result of this foreign trade in the 16th century, there was this huge expansion of commercial activity. Of course, there was a lot of economic growth within China, explained. Agriculture was growing, so was manufacturing and commerce, especially along the Yangtze. And of course, what the foreigners were above all interested in were the silks and the porcelain. Later on, in the late 17th century, perhaps the even more important tea trade, the trade in tea, the Europeans developed a vast appetite for Chinese tea. And we're getting a little bit beyond what I'm immediately talking about, but might as well mention it. In addition to silk and porcelain, toward the end of the 17th century, vast tea plantations developed, particularly along the Yangtze. The Chinese, of course, love their tea, but the Europeans developed a taste for tea, and of course, also coffee. I'll talk about coffee later. Now, the foreigners had to bring silver. Chinese wanted silver, and so there was both Asians and Westerners had to bring silver if they wanted these Chinese luxury products. And some of this took the old route through the Indian Ocean around the Cape of Good Horn and so on. But a lot of it also, the Spaniards, because they occupied Mexico with all of the silver mines, they sent what they call the Manila galleons from the west of Mexico across the Pacific Ocean to the Philippine Islands. Manila became a very important trading city in the 16th century, and the bullion would be shipped to China, and the Manila galleons would bring back the silks and porcelains across Mexico and onwards to Europe. This whole trade developed right through the 16th century. It reached its peak around 1570, and then gradually there was a decline between 1570 and 1620. The flow of silver declined, and we've encountered this before because we saw, look what happened to the Ottoman Empire with the decline of the silver. Look what happened to Spain with the decline of silver. And we see a similar process in China. Gradually, the Chinese economy fell into crisis as a result of the end of the silver boom. And as a result of this growing economic crisis, which was serious by 1620, a lot of merchants became bankrupt. There was a string of big bankruptcies in China. The revenues of the government, because the government revenues are related, the taxes that they're able to collect is related to the amount of economic activity. So government revenues were declining. This began to affect the political capacity of the Ming government. They had wars with Japan. I told you about this war with Japan. There were these expensive incursions into Mongolia. And increasingly, the Chinese government had to consider a growing threat from the northeast. That is to say, the area which we now know as Manchuria there was growing hostility between China and Manchuria, which I will speak about momentarily. But in addition to these, so you have the decline of the silver trade, you have bankruptcies, you have commercial and economic depression, you have state revenues begin to decline, and you have a growing threat from Manchuria. And last but not least, in fact, the most important of all is that the peasantry in northern China begins to rebel against the Ming government from the 1620s onwards. And why was this? Well, we saw that way back in the 14th century when the Mings took power, there was this big land reform, and the peasants got 50% of the land when the state took the land from the landlords and gave it to the peasants. Well, 300 years have passed, and the market being what it is, the market is all about losers and winners and losers. A market, as it works, there will be some frankly, sort of totally academic scholars who will say markets are always, equal, everybody has an equal opportunity and so on. Well, that's not true in experience. Certain people are more equal than others. And over time, you allow a market to continue without regulation, there will be more and more losers, and fewer, the wealth will become concentrated. Witness the society we live in today. It started out much more equal 100, 150 years ago. Now there's 5%, 1%, they control just about everything. And the same thing happened once again in China. Added to which, the situation was made worse by the fact that the population was growing. So you have a problem of landlessness. A lot of peasants have completely lost their land. And so a series of revolts began in northern China. Now let's talk a little bit about the Manchus. The Manchus were, as I say, Manchuria is now part of China. Manchuria became part of China. And the period that we're talking about, the 15th, 16th century, these people were hunters, they were gatherers. It was a kind of tribal setup. There was a sort of subsistence farming in Manchuria as well as hunting and gathering. And they were the leaders of the Manchus, the main group in Manchuria. They recognized the authority of the emperor. They were tributary to the Chinese emperor. Manchuria was under China in the way I've explained, the tributary system. However, toward the end of the 16th century, there emerged a strong leader by the name of Nurhaci, keywords, Nurhaci, who lived between 1559 and 1626. And he unified the Manchurian state and basically made himself the ruler of a unified Manchurian government. And while the Ming began to decline, this government in Manchuria got stronger and stronger politically and militarily. And in 1616, Nurhaci basically renounced fealty to Beijing. No, they said, well, we're independent, we have nothing to do with Imperial China. And this is 1616, and in 1618, 2 years later, he invaded Ming territory. He crossed from southern Manchuria into the Manchurian army invaded northern China. In the meantime, the peasant revolt became more and more serious, and there was an individual, a peasant, Li Zicheng, who died in 1645, again, key word. He became the leader of the unified peasant armies operating in northern China. And in the spring of 1644, this army had become, the peasant army, had become so powerful that they were able to occupy the capital. Beijing fell to the peasant uprising in northern China. However, notice this happens in 1645, and this had happened way back in the 14th century. Remember old Zhu Wanzhang, the founder of the Ming Empire. He was a peasant. He led the peasant armies in the south of China and overthrew the Yuan dynasty, the Mongolian dynasty, expelled them, and set himself up as the first Ming emperor. So it looked like that Li Zheng would do exactly the same thing. But no, what happened was that the senior bureaucrats in Beijing and the military leaders of the imperial army, they opened negotiations with the Manchu leaders, and they reached an agreement that what had to happen was the peasants had to be suppressed. And together, the imperial government, which was falling, and the advancing Manchus basically crushed the peasant rebellion, and a new dynasty was established. This dynasty is known as the Qing dynasty, Qing, the Qing dynasty, as in king, only with a Q, Qing dynasty. The year is 1644, and this Qing dynasty, which is essentially a dynasty of foreigners, Manchus from Manchuria, they're not Han. They become the new rulers of China. And the Han upper class, the leaders of the imperial army and the landlord class and the bureaucracy, they all accept the rule of the Manchus, the rule of the king, because faced with the peasant uprising, they choose the Manchus over the peasants. And so the outcome is different from what happened in the 14th century. Of course, it took some time. This is all of these events are occurring in northern China. It took years for the king to firmly establish their power. It was only in 1679, 40 years later, that the king were fully in control of the Chinese mainland, and the island of Taiwan, which was part of China, it fell in 1681. So full consolidation of the king, this new dynasty, only occurred in 1681. And of course, that from this point onwards, the whole top apparatus of the state was Manchu. The Manchus, they dominated the court. Senior positions were all reserved to them. But the Chinese, the Han elites, they were under the Manchus, and they sort of served the Manchu rulers. That was the character of the Qing dynasty. By the 18th century, we can say that the Qing dynasty had fully consolidated itself. There is this consolidation, and in the 18th century, the Qing dynasty creates political stability, and there is a renewal of economic prosperity. The period of the decline that I spoke about that set in from 1570 onwards was overcome, and the 18th century was, from an economic point of view, it was a period of prosperity, especially for the upper classes, and China's global trade in Asia and with Europe was substantial in the 18th century. And remember, I spoke about the tea trade as being very important. Moreover, we can say that this powerful state now flexed its muscles, and it's at this point that Mongolia, the Mongolians, who had constantly invaded China through the Middle Ages, and again trying to do so in the early modern period, this now became part of the Chinese state. Likewise, the Chinese armies advanced into Tibet, and Tibet became a part of the Chinese state. Indeed, Han peasants who didn't have land, the Chinese state, the Qing state, sent pioneers toward that whole area, toward Tibet and into Mongolia. Han Chinese peasants, pioneers, 20 million Han Chinese agriculturalists settled in these areas, and it helped to relieve the population or demographic problem, landlessness of the population. Furthermore, in the 18th century, and this parallels what's happening in Europe, corn, the Chinese, they knew all about rice, they knew all about wheat. We saw that in the 16th century, the potato, peanuts. Well, in the 18th century, corn becomes an important crop, a source of food as well. And of course, there's also the constant expansion of the cotton growing areas, commercial crop, silk growing areas, a commercial crop, tea growing areas, a lot of commercial activity. I would say that this Qing state, for all the prosperity, did not address the fundamental problem, which was rising population and the growing problem of landlessness. The population was rising. Indeed, by the beginning of the 19th century, it stood at 365 million people. Remember that at the beginning of the Ming period, there were 85 million people. And now at the beginning of the 19th century, the population stood at 365 million. And so what I'm saying is that the base of the society, yes, there is this superficial prosperity, but there is a deepening problem of poverty, and we'll see. Now, there were also problems higher up in society, in the sense that the Confucian system was intact, the examination system was intact, and with the growing population, more and more applicants, more and more people wanted to get into law school. I'm just joking. That more and more people wanted to become mandarins. So the competition, you know what I'm talking about, I don't have to explain. There were more and more applicants and people frustrated who were educated. So you take an educated population, which is also frustrated, and it spells trouble, and, as we'll see. Meanwhile, there was a certain change in Confucianism. Remember that under the Ming, Confucianism was extremely conservative. Well, it changed under the Qing. There was a more open attitude. a more empirical attitude. Some scholars said we have to learn from the past. Other scholars said we have to learn from practice. A more empirical, positivist attitude developed amongst some of these Confucian scholars. And the regime itself did something very important. The emperor declared that all of the known books in China, and there were thousands of books in China at this point, dating from the early, back to the Han period and even before, that he ordered that all of these books now be collected and reprinted and put into the Imperial Library and other libraries in China. At the same time, while this was done, this was called the Complete Library of the Four Treasuries. The Complete Library of the Four Treasuries, some 16,000 volumes in all. At the same time, he ordered, the emperor, that all seditious books, all books that were in some way considered to be deviant, and this is important because, yes, there was a more liberal attitude, but it was only within a certain restricted range. All books deemed seditious or pornographic, those were destroyed by order of the state. And so I would say that the 18th century was a good period, but underlying there was a growing economic and social malaise. And as the 18th century continued, the first areas where you saw this expressing itself was on the hinterlands, in the more remote territories, away from Beijing, away from Nanjing, along the edges of the Chinese state. Various ethnic groups began to rebel toward the latter part of the 18th century. And then at the end of the 18th century, and you can consult key words on this, there was rebellion toward the center of China. In China in the 18th century, a whole series of secret societies developed. Secret societies. And why secret societies? Because the Chinese state didn't permit open dissent. This was an authoritarian absolute system. And so if you wanted to dissent, you establish a secret society. So secret societies proliferated. And in the first place, in Shantung, again, in keywords, between 1786 and 1788, a rebellion developed, led by a secret society known as the Eight Trigrams. Again, key words, the Eight Trigram Rebellion, 1786, 1788. And then in sort of further west of Shantung is on the coast, the peninsula, inland, there developed a second rebellion led by a secret society known as the White Lotus Rebellion. This occurred between 1795 and 1804. And finally, in 1811, throughout the area that is northeast China, a third rebellion led by the Society of the Heavenly Principle. And this was all unfolding at a time when, first of all, the expansion that I told you about into Mongolia, into Tibet was expensive. The state had to raise taxes. There was growing corruption. There's always corruption, growing corruption. And the sort of if you add all of this up, if you add up the basic agrarian problem, and that's the most important problem of population, and the growing expense of the state, while the people at the bottom are getting poorer and poorer. And then you have these seditious groups beginning to organize themselves. The stage was set for the intrusion of the foreigners, the intrusion of the Europeans into Chinese society. Of course, as we'll speak about, the Europeans were getting stronger and stronger. You'll see that the 18th century was a period of vast prosperity, especially in the more advanced capitalist countries like England, like Holland, and also France. France was not capitalist at this point, but it was still feudal, but the capitalist class was getting stronger and stronger in France. And so these economies were growing, and they in particular were getting stronger and stronger when it came to international commerce. They completely dominated the Ottoman Empire. They dominated the Americas, and they were increasingly present in Asia. We saw that the British had basically, by this point, taken over Asia. And so to come to China, I would say that at first, after the Ming fell and the king took over, at first the new government tried to consolidate control. They cut off all trade with foreigners. There was no foreign trade for some years. But then around 1685, on a tentative basis, the new Chinese government, the Qing government, said that certain foreign merchants could come back, that there would be a reopening of trade from 1685. And as I have explained, a number of ports, including Hong Kong, were opened up to foreign merchants. And in the 18th century, in particular, the most important outpost was not Hong Kong, it was Canton. Canton was the most important government. Well, what we're going to see next time is the English come to China, and the result of that, we'll see this in the next class.